They spent decades trying to erase my name. Not quietly, loudly, publicly, methodically. They used the press, they used the courts. They used a psychiatric institution and a mother who believed she was doing the right thing. They used every tool the most powerful entertainment system in the world had at its disposal, and they aimed all of it at me. Not because I was dangerous, not because I was unstable, because I looked the studio system directly in the eye and said no, and meant it, and kept meaning it, no matter what it cost me. Most people who know my name know the outline, the arrests, the institution, the years that disappeared. But the outline is exactly what the system wanted you to have. Enough information to form a judgment, not enough to form an understanding. Because if you understand what actually happened, if you follow the chain of decisions and signatures and phone calls and deliberate silences that produced my story, you stop seeing a troubled actress and you start seeing something else entirely. You start seeing a mechanism, a machine that was very good at disguising punishment as care, erasure as concern, and cruelty as common sense. This is not a story about a woman who fell apart. This is a story about a woman who held together, who stayed herself, completely and uncompromisingly herself, in the face of an industry that needed her not to be. And I'm the one telling it, in my own words, the words they spent a very long time making sure you never heard. The unspoken history of one of the most documented injustices in the golden age of cinema, told by the only person who was actually there for all of it, from the beginning, before the cameras, before the contracts, before the walls closed in. This is where it starts. Seattle, 1930s. You want to know what kind of place produces someone like me? The kind where the rain never really stops, and neither does the judgment. My mother was a woman who believed in appearances the way other people believe in God, with total devotion and zero tolerance for doubt. My father was quieter, kind in his way, but quiet men don't stop anything. They just watch it happen. I was maybe 15 when I wrote the essay. The school asked us about God, about faith, about what we believed, and I told them. I said God was a concept invented by men who needed an answer they couldn't find anywhere else. I said I didn't believe in something I couldn't see, couldn't question, couldn't argue with. Hell, I said a lot of things. The kind of things that get a girl called in front of the principal, then in front of the school board, then written up in the local papers as a scandal. I was 15, and that was the first time I understood something important. The moment you say what you actually think, the room turns cold. They wanted me to apologize. My mother wanted me to apologize. The school wanted a retraction, something soft, something that would make the whole mess go away. And I sat there in that office, looking at all those faces waiting for me to fold, and I thought, why would I do that? I was right. I knew I was right. And there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being right too early, in the wrong room, surrounded by people who need you to be wrong. That loneliness followed me for the rest of my life. I just didn't know it yet. The studio found me, or I found them. It doesn't much matter which way you tell it, because the ending is the same either way. What I remember is the contract. Pages and pages of it, dense and cold, and somewhere in all that legal language was the part nobody reads out loud. The part that says, you belong to us now. Not your name, not your face, not the way you move through a room or laugh at something that actually strikes you as funny. All of it. Theirs. They had a machine out there in California, and God help me, it was something to see. The golden age of cinema was running at full speed. The sets were enormous, the lights were blinding, the clothes they put you in cost more than most people made in a year. There was a glamour to it that I won't pretend didn't exist. It existed. It was real. But glamour, I learned fast, is a transaction. The studio system knew exactly what it was selling, and it knew exactly what it needed from you to sell it. They wanted a version of me, the cheekbones, the voice, the intensity, but smoothed down, manageable. The kind of woman who photographs like a goddess and causes nobody any trouble on a Monday morning. The trouble was, I was never that woman, not for a single day of my life. I'd sit in those meetings, listening to some producer tell me who I was going to be in the next picture, what I was going to wear, what I was going to say to the press, and I'd feel this thing rising in my chest. Not anger exactly, not yet. Something quieter, a recognition. They don't want me. They want something shaped like me, something that uses my face and my voice, but leaves the rest of me outside in the parking lot. And I kept thinking, what exactly do I do with that? New York hit me like a window opening in a room that's been sealed too long. I'd been in Hollywood long enough to know what it wanted from me, and I'd been saying no in small ways. The raised eyebrow in the meeting, the script I sent back with notes they didn't ask for, the interview where I said something true when I should have said something useful. But New York was different. The theater was different. These were people who believed that acting was something you did with your whole body and your whole history and your whole mind, not just your face under the right lighting. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in a room full of people who were speaking my language. The group theater was the real thing. Serious work, political work, work that assumed the audience had a brain and wasn't afraid to use it. We were doing plays that meant something, plays about class, about power, about the way ordinary people get ground down by systems that were never built with them in mind. And I wasn't just performing those ideas. I believed them. That's the part that's hard to explain to someone who spent their whole life inside the studio system. There's a difference between playing a character and actually standing for something. One of them is a job. The other one is who you are. I was never very good at keeping those two things separate. The studio didn't like it. Of course they didn't. Every month I spent in New York was a month I wasn't on their lot, making their pictures, building the image they'd invested in. They started calling it a phase, a distraction. Some of the producers used a word I won't repeat here, but the meaning was clear. A woman with ideas is a woman with a problem, and a woman with a problem is bad for business. What they couldn't understand, what they genuinely could not wrap their minds around, was that the theater wasn't a detour from my career. It was my career. The rest of it, the studio, the contracts, the Hollywood machinery, that was the detour. I just hadn't figured out yet how much it was going to cost me to say that out loud. The script came in on a Tuesday. I remember because I read it twice before I put it down, and then I sat there for a long time, looking out the window at nothing in particular. It was a nothing part, decorative, soft, the kind of role where the woman exists to reflect the man standing next to her. No interior life, no real stakes, nothing that would require me to bring anything true to the work. And they wanted me in it because my face was selling tickets, and they needed my face in something fast. That was the whole calculation. I was a number in a ledger, and the ledger needed balancing. I sent it back. I said no. And the room went very, very quiet. The trip came shortly after, and I want to be precise about what it was and what it wasn't. I went because I believed in certain ideas about art and about collective work and about what theater could be when it wasn't just a product. I went openly. I didn't hide it. And when I came back, the industry had already decided what the trip meant, who I was because of it. what category I belonged in now. The word communist was starting to move through certain conversations the way smoke moves through a building. You can't see exactly where it's coming from, but suddenly it's everywhere and everything smells like it. I hadn't changed. The room had changed around me. That's how it works. When they decide they're done with you, they don't announce it. They just rearrange the furniture until there's nowhere left for you to sit. The list of enemies I didn't know I had kept growing. The studio, the columnists, my own mother in her way, though that's a longer story and a darker one. What I understood by then was that every time I'd said no, every time I'd refused a role or missed a publicity call or said something in an interview that was true instead of useful, I was making a deposit in an account I didn't know existed. And one day, without warning, someone was going to collect. I just didn't know what the collection looked like yet. I didn't know it had a name. I didn't know it had walls and locks and men in white coats. I was about to find out. There was a period, and I want to be honest about this without sentimentality, because sentimentality was never my style. There was a period when it was extraordinary, when the whole machinery of the golden age of cinema was pointed directly at you, when every resource that Hollywood could assemble was in service of making you luminous on a screen. There is something to that. I won't pretend otherwise. The costumes alone, hand-sewn, fitted to the quarter-inch, fabrics that caught the light in ways that seemed almost architectural. You'd stand in wardrobe for 2 hours and walk out feeling like someone had built a cathedral around your body. That part was real. The sets were worlds. Entire streets constructed on a lot in California. Period details so precise you'd forget for a moment what decade you were actually standing in. The cinematographers knew exactly what they were doing. The angle of the key light, the way a shadow could fall across a face to suggest something the script hadn't quite said. I understood the craft of it. I respected the craft of it. And on the days when the work was good, when the scene had real weight and the director was paying attention and something true was happening between the actors on that set, on those days, I understood why people gave their whole lives to this industry. I understood the pull of it, the intoxication of being at the center of the most glamorous machine the 20th century had ever produced. What I remember most, though, is not the costumes or the sets or the lights. What I remember is the stillness just before the camera rolled. That particular silence on a set when everything is ready and everyone is waiting, and for just a moment the whole world narrows down to this one thing you're about to do. In that moment, I wasn't a problem to be managed, or a contract to be honored, or a headline waiting to happen. I was just an actress, doing the only thing I'd ever been genuinely good at. They couldn't take that moment from me. They took almost everything else, but not that. The first arrest was for a traffic violation. That's what it was, a ticket, an unpaid fine, something so small it shouldn't have made the papers at all. But it made the papers, front page in some of them. And I want you to understand what that means, how that works, because it didn't happen by accident. Someone made a call. Someone decided that this particular minor infraction by this particular woman was news, was a story, was evidence of something larger and more damning than an unpaid ticket. The machinery that had once been pointed at making me luminous was now pointed in the other direction, and it was just as efficient, maybe more so. Destruction, I was learning, is faster than construction. It always is. The photograph from the precinct went everywhere. I've seen it since, reproduced in books, in documentaries, in articles about the dark side of classic Hollywood, and what strikes me every time is not how I look in it, but how deliberate its circulation was. A woman in distress, hair loose, expression unguarded. That image was useful to a lot of people. It confirmed a narrative that was already being written. The difficult star, the unstable actress, the woman who couldn't be controlled finally coming apart at the seams. Hollywood noir has always needed its cautionary tales, and I was being cast in one without anyone asking if I wanted the part. The columnists sharpened their pencils. The studio issued careful statements full of concern that contained not a single gram of actual concern. And through all of it, the arrests, the headlines, the concerned statements, the photographers waiting outside, I refused to perform the remorse they wanted. That's the part they couldn't forgive, I think. Not the drinking, not the confrontations, not the things they claimed I'd said or done. The thing they truly could not stomach was that I wouldn't apologize for existing the way I existed. A woman who breaks down and weeps and says, "I don't know what came over me," is a story with a satisfying shape. The fall, the regret, the redemption arc waiting in the wings. A woman who looks back at the room with clear eyes and says, "I know exactly what I did, and I'd do it again." That woman is a problem that requires a different kind of solution. They were already working on it. I'm going to tell you what happened. Not the version that appeared in the papers, not the version my mother told to whoever would listen, not the version the industry settled on because it was tidier than the truth. I'm going to tell you what happened. They committed me. Not because I was a danger to anyone, not because I had lost my grip on reality, because I was inconvenient. And inconvenient women in the 1940s had a diagnosis waiting for them the way a coat has a hook, ready, available, and shaped exactly right for the purpose. The commitment papers were signed, the doors closed behind me, and the world outside went on as if I had simply ceased to exist. What they did inside those walls I will describe once, and I will not embellish it because it doesn't need embellishment. The insulin shock treatments, the procedures performed without consent, without explanation, sometimes without anesthesia. Wards that smelled like fear and disinfectant, and the specific hopelessness of people who have stopped expecting anyone to come. I was not the only woman in there who had committed the crime of being difficult. I was not the only one whose family had signed the papers, whose industry had looked away, whose name had been quietly moved from the active column to the forgotten one. We were not patients. We were problems that had been filed, and the filing system had no appeals process. My mother visited. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My mother, who had spent my entire life trying to sand me down into something more acceptable, something that wouldn't embarrass her at church or at the neighbor's dinner table. My mother came and sat across from me in that place, and I could see in her face that she believed she had done the right thing. That is perhaps the coldest thing I have ever felt in my life. Not the institution, not the treatments, not the years going by outside those walls without me. The coldest thing was looking at my own mother and understanding that to her, this was love. That she had put me here because she loved me and couldn't figure out what else to do with me. The lost film history of my life was being written in that room by a woman who thought she was saving me. They let me out. Eventually. That's the word they used. Let. As if it were a favor. As if the years inside were a debt I'd run up and finally paid off to everyone's satisfaction. I walked out into a world that had kept moving without me. And I want to tell you that I came out swinging, that I rebuilt everything, that the story has the kind of ending that makes the injustice feel contained and survivable. But I promise you the truth, and the truth is quieter and harder than that. I came out diminished. not broken. I was never broken, and I want to be precise about that distinction, but diminished. Like a fire that's still burning, but in a smaller room than it was built for. The industry was not waiting for me. Of course it wasn't. Hollywood has always had a short memory for the people it discards and a long one for the people it needs, and I was firmly in the first category now. The unspoken history of what had been done to me existed in whispers, in the way certain people wouldn't meet my eyes at certain parties, in the careful language used by anyone who wrote about me publicly. Nobody said we put her away because she wouldn't cooperate. Nobody said the studio system destroyed her because she refused to be owned. They said she had difficulties. They said she had struggled. Passive language for active cruelty. The grammar of people who know exactly what was done and have decided never to say so directly. I tried. I want that on the record. I tried. There were small roles, regional theater, a television appearance or two that reminded people I still existed. But the machinery that makes a career in this industry is not neutral. It has memory. It has preference. And its preference was for women who had learned the correct lesson from my story, which was not resist, but comply. I had refused to learn that lesson, and the system had made an example of me that was still doing its work long after I was out of those walls. Every young actress who heard what happened to me and softened her edges a little, said yes when she meant no, smiled for a camera she wanted to turn away from. She was the real product of what they did. I was the warning. They made sure of it. Here is what I know. Not what I suspect, not what I've come to believe through years of bitterness or regret. What I know, with the clarity that only comes from having lived inside the machinery and survived it. The Hollywood studio system was not a place that occasionally made mistakes about certain people. It was a structure, a deliberate, efficient, profit-driven structure that required compliance the way an engine requires fuel, constantly, completely, with no tolerance for contamination. I was not an accident. I was not a tragedy. I was a test case. And the verdict they reached with me was meant to be read by everyone who came after. The classic Hollywood scandals that fill the books and the documentaries, they are presented as aberrations. Moments when the glamour slipped and something ugly showed underneath. But that's not what they were. The ugliness wasn't underneath the glamour. It was the glamour from a different angle. The same system that built the golden age of cinema, that produced the icons and the images and the cinematic storytelling that the whole world fell in love with. That system ran on the labor and the silence and the suffering of the people inside it. Behind the scenes, Hollywood looked nothing like the front of it. And the people who knew that and said so out loud were removed. Quietly when possible, publicly when necessary. I was necessary. What I want you to take from my story is not pity. I have no use for pity, and I never did. What I want you to take is precision, the precise understanding that what was done to me was not done by monsters. It was done by ordinary people protecting ordinary interests with the tools that were available to them. A signature on a commitment form, a phone call to a columnist, a studio statement full of careful concern. Small actions, each one deniable on its own, that added up to the erasure of a human being. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. And the only thing that has ever slowed it down, the only thing, is someone deciding that the cost of saying the truth out loud is worth paying. So now you know, not the version they printed. Not the version that got repeated until it started to sound like fact, the real one. And I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, not as a device, but because I genuinely want you to sit with it. How many times have you watched someone get labeled difficult and accepted the label without asking who applied it and why, and what they needed that person to stop doing. How many times have you watched a system protect itself by pathologizing the people who refuse to protect it? Because what happened to me wasn't a historical anomaly. It was a template. And templates get reused. The golden age of cinema gave the world something real. Beauty, storytelling, images that lasted. I'm not here to take that away from anyone. But behind the scenes, Hollywood was also a place where compliance was enforced with extraordinary brutality, where the machinery of classic Hollywood scandals was not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it. The women who disappeared, the careers that ended without explanation, the names that stopped appearing in the trades overnight. They didn't all end up where I ended up, but they were all nudged in the same direction by the same hand. And most of them learned to nudge themselves eventually because they'd seen what happened to me. If my story does anything, I want it to do this. I want it to make you harder to convince. Harder to convince that the official version is the whole version. Harder to convince that someone who causes trouble is the problem rather than the symptom. Harder to convince that the institutions built to contain people like me were built for your protection. They weren't. They were built for theirs. I paid the price for knowing that too early and saying it too loudly. You get to know it for free. The least you can do is pass it on. Share this. Talk about it. And come back, because there are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.